Okay. All right. So, Michelle, roll call. Thanks, Grant.
Mr. Boykin. Mr. Lawson.
Here.
Miss Dillon.
Here.
Mr. Rosensteel.
Here.
Chairperson Hendricks, you have a quorum.
Excellent. Great. So our first item is our approval of the committee agenda and work plan.
So moved. Second.
Great. Thank you. Now we have the state and federal legislation.
I'm sorry, was there a vote on that motion?
I'm sorry?
Was there a vote on the?
Oh, move to
Aye.
move to approve.
Yeah.
Aye. All those not in favor? Approved. Okay. Sorry. We're learning the process here. All right. So now we have Marianne Ashley, update on state and federal legislation. Marianne.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
There's 3 bills today that will be presented for the committee members to take action on as to adopting a position. I'd like to begin with AB 382 by Assemblymember Mullen. Under current law, records of public investment funds regarding alternative investments are excluded from required disclosure under the Public Records Act. Alternative funds are defined as a private equity fund, a venture fund, hedge fund, or absolute return fund. In addition, existing law also exempts specific information from disclosure if the information is considered to be highly confidential and it is determined that the public's interest in non-disclosure outweighs the public's interest in disclosure. In the past, CalSTRS has not disclose specific strategic information related to its real estate investment based on this provision. However, it's very time-consuming for staff to go through the process to come to the determination to withhold the information, balancing the interest of disclosure versus non-disclosure. AB 382 would specifically exempt non-publicly direct and indirect real estate investments from disclosure by including these in the definition of alternative fund. By including these real estate transactions in the definition of an alternative investment and thereby excluding these transactions from the disclosure requirement, the review process of PRA requests related to real estate investments could be streamlined. The bill would protect certain internal investment processes from public disclosure without infringing on the public's right to access investment information, as key metrics of CalSTRS real estate investments would still be available and investment information currently made publicly available would not be changed or diminished. Additionally, the measure would add to or include alternative investments in the list of items exempt from the Brown Act so that the county retirement systems will have the same protections as the statewide retirement systems. CalSTRS currently responds to public record requests related to real estate investment in accordance with the law, and the bill will not diminish or change that information that CalSTRS has made publicly available in the past. Therefore, staff is recommending that the board adopt a neutral position on this measure. Are there any questions?
Any questions from the committee? Mr. Boykin.
Thanks. I was just going to ask, so that the main benefit would be administratively, it's a little easier to say no, to withhold information?
Administratively, that process could be streamlined. Additionally, it protects certain investments from risks, I would say, because they're not having to be disclosed. So the opportunity to invest at a lower risk would be protected.
I do, or else I can't sit there. That's a name.
Sorry.
I was just going to add, from an investment perspective, this is an advantage to us. We like this bill, but we understand the desire to be neutral on it. So if it passes, that'll be great. If it doesn't, we'll continue to operate the way we have.
I think it's fair to say that we haven't, obviously, we're not coming forth with the idea, so we didn't find an objection responding to requests in this manner. So, I mean, I think Chris saying there's some advantage to it, but clearly the current law wasn't in any way handcuffing us in any way. And you need to balance this, frankly, with public transparency. We didn't talk a lot about that, but that is a very valid issue. This is a public board, and there's clearly a lot of weight in that. So this is an issue with two very good sides to it. And of course, again, this isn't at our initiation, this bill, in any way.
Okay, and on that note, I just have to say Treasurer Locke here, because of that, because of the transparency and the public perception, he would, rather have an opposed position to the bill.
I think that's valid to discuss too. I mean, the transparency thing is very real as an issue, but I think it's something you all should discuss.
Can you expand on that?
Understanding the administrative ease that the legislation could bring to the investment office, there is still a perception issue. Anything that would hinder, easier access to information is something that, in general, the treasurer is very much for transparency and openness, understanding that sometimes that can be difficult. So.
And the early media on this has been negative. There's no doubt about it. So.
I have to let you know from the chief investment officer perspective, there's a fiduciary line here that if you pursue more disclosure, I would come to you and say you're crossing that line and hurting your fiduciary responsibility. I understand the balance between that level of transparency and that need to provide information to the public, but there's also a level of your ability and our ability to operate, particularly in the real estate area, in negotiations in a closed session manner and keep information, particularly at the partnership level, that we would be harmed relative to our peer group if we disclosed.
But the current law hasn't been a problem, Chris, you're saying?
The way we've interpreted the current law has not been a problem.
Yeah.
Right.
If we went deeper and
That's the
went
point.
the other way, then we very much, the investment staff wants to support this bill very much, but we understood the executive position to move neutral, so we had an alternative point of view on this bill.
Understand. Thanks.
Sharon? Yeah.
This is Brian. But I wanted to just add something about this and to follow up on Grant's comments. All the requests for Public Records Act requests and requests for information are reviewed by the legal office. And so we very carefully review our legal responsibilities, our fiduciary responsibilities, as well as our responsibility to be transparent and provide the information. And that is how we've always handled these. We try to err on the side of transparency. So we very carefully work with the investment staff and with fiduciary counsel when we see that there may be an issue or if there's something that's clearly confidential or shouldn't be disclosed under the plain reading of the statute. So I wanted to make sure that you understood that this is, even though we're talking about sort of the administrative burden, we're always going to review and we're always going to do our very best to provide the information to the public that they need, at the same time being cognizant of the issues that fiduciary duty and the ability to go forward and act. So I just wanted you to know that legal has a major role in this operation.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Dana?
I'd move a neutral on AB 382, Mullen.
Is there a second?
Second.
Did you want to speak as well? Okay. All right. So, any other discussion? So, do we want to hear the other two, or do we need to on each one vote? Okay. So should we all in favor for a neutral position on this bill? Aye. Any opposed?
No.
Did you get that, Michelle? Okay, great. Okay, so we're going to take a neutral position on AB 382. All right.
Grant, did you want some clarification for the no vote in the minutes? It could be construed the opposite too. That's why I want to make sure it's clear that your position is relative to the issue of greater transparency.
Clear in the record that
Yeah.
our no isn't that we want to
Yeah, exactly.
improve position. that we would rather, the treasurer would rather support an opposed position.
Right. Okay, I think we'll make sure the minutes clearly indicate that direction, since it might be misinterpreted.
Okay, Marianne, do you want to do 761?
AB 761 prohibits CalSTRS from investing in companies that manufacture firearms or ammunition for a recipient other than the United States military, subject to the board's fiduciary duties and following a process as specified in the bill. The measure includes provisions and divestment processes that are very similar to those included in the California Public Divest from Iran Act. Currently, according to policy, CalSTRS investment managers are required to consider 21 separate risk factors when investing for CalSTRS. In addition to the stringent geopolitical risk policy, the board has also adopted a divestment policy that allows the board to exclude investments in companies according to criteria set forth in the policy. One of the board's core values has been to ensure the strength of the retirement system, by proactively addressing the risks of investing and by abiding by the fiduciary standards set forth in the teacher's retirement law. According to investment policies and in keeping with fiduciary responsibilities, if the investment committee determines that making an investment or continuing to hold a security is imprudent or inconsistent with the fiduciary duty or board policies, it will instruct the investment staff to remove the security from the portfolio. At the January 9th, 2013 Investment Committee meeting, CalSTRS investment staff were directed to implement the CalSTRS divestment policy consistent with fiduciary duties to divest of companies that manufacture firearms or large capacity magazines that are illegal for sale or possession by private individuals in California under state law. AB 761 is a broader application of that direction of the investment committee and would prohibit CalSTRS from investing in companies that not only manufacture firearms and ammunition that is illegal in California, but from companies that manufacture any firearms or ammunition for a recipient other than the United States military. The measure requires CalSTRS to take action according to engagement and divestment processes that are specified in the measure. And as I mentioned, they're very similar to those that are provided for in the California Public Divest from Iran Act. The measure does include provisions for the board to not take such action if the board determines in good faith that taking such action would fail to satisfy the fiduciary responsibilities of the board. However, the measure does not indemnify the board and staff for losses that the Teachers Retirement Fund may incur that would be a result from carrying out the requirements of the measure. Staff is recommending that the board adopt a neutral, if amended, position to limit the prohibition on investments to investments in companies that manufacture firearms and ammunition in which such lines of business represent a minimum percentage of the company's revenues, such as a 15%, and to indemnify the board and staff from losses to the Teachers Retirement Fund that may result from carrying out the provisions of the measure. Are there any questions?
Questions from the committee? Grant?
Chris, you're still here.
I wanted to speak to this one.
Okay, so I would like to hear your opinion, and then I also have questions about the extent to which our staff has tried to work with Mr. Dickinson and his staff to try and get this to a form that works for us, that fits more with our own investment policy.
Thanks, Grant. I did want to speak to this one. You won't be surprised again that as your CIO, I had an alternative recommendation. But with that said, I fully understand why the board might want to take a neutral position with Representative Dickinson, and especially this year. From our perspective, not just this bill, but any divestment bill, the legislature has the power to basically step on your fiduciary duty. But I always want to point out to you what they're doing is they're taking away some of your authority but they're still holding you responsible. And, you know, it's a classic kind of government move. The bottom line is if you're responsible for it, you better have full authority, and they hold you to that fiduciary and we're seeing that now where they're pointing at us on everything. So we do have some problems with the bill. That's why it has to be amended. I mean, right there at the beginning, you can see, you know, we've explained in our process how these firearms have a police and use, and PERS is going to have to deal with this because it means that they can't own a company that would sell products to the CHP or to the state police. So there's just lots of problems. It's always hard to do this in a legislative process. And I think, obviously, we're going to deal with it tomorrow, but we think you've done it in a proper fiduciary manner consistent with your authority and your responsibility. So as your CIO, I never like to see us allowing the legislature to trample on your authority. The bill does expand beyond the definition that we've used for firearms. It does have some complications. If you recall when we talked about firearms versus products banned in California, not to get into the real nitty-gritty details, but there is a company that makes trophy hunting rifles. That's the same company in France that owns Mont Blanc and a bunch of other names. This is a really small subsidiary, but it's a very large position for us in the EFA index. So this bill would touch that potentially where your actions would not, and yours are you have the ability to be nimble if something would change or if a company would change. In the way the bill's written, it makes it more cumbersome. So hopefully that answered your question, Grant.
Yeah, I guess the only thing that I would say is regardless of what position we take, if staff can work, you know, continue to work with.
And we'll talk about that a little bit, what the opportunity side of it is. But I just want to make sure, Marion, the language in the relative of the fiduciary aspect of it, is that similar to the Sudan and RAND bills? It's identical. Okay.
It's the same statement that's included.
Marianne, talking to the mic.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, I just want to make sure the bill wasn't structured
Yes, it
differently.
is the same language that's included.
We spent so much legal time on those bills. Ed, do you want to talk about just, you know, where things could change?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is that just with respect to Chris's comment around the one investment, the amendment that we're recommending would address that because that's where that minimum threshold comes into play because the firearms aspect of that company is extraordinarily small. And so it would eliminate that one. That's why we were particularly concerned about picking on only significant firearm manufacturers. With respect to our work with the Assembly Member's office, to a large degree, I mean, there have been some communications with them, and I know CalSTRS has as well. You know, one thing that had been suggested to him was, why don't you just sort of codify what the boards are already doing, and he clearly had no interest in doing that. He wanted to do something beyond that. And quite honestly, I think we're really waiting to get some direction from the committee about what is it that you would like us to do, because it has a lot more impact with an Assembly member to say, this is what the board's position is as opposed to this is what the staff wants. So, you know, whatever direction you give us, we will work with Dickens' office to try to get that implemented.
And again, I think Brian is going to talk to you a little bit about the constitutional aspects of this, but again, I wouldn't be taking positions relative to strategies and other issues. I mean, this needs to be evaluated on its own merits and why it's being brought forth. So I think you need to focus on the bill and its own reasons, not something else that might be affecting your judgment.
I would. I have Dana in the queue, and I guess I'd like to put Ian on call here because I'd like to hear more about the fiduciary duty piece that Chris raised and that's being raised here. So, Dana, do you want to ask your question, then we can have Ian comment on that?
Chris, remind me of the position that Cerberus had in Freedom. Was it greater than the 15%?
Because they own the company outright, and the company only makes firearms.
Okay, so that then would have been considered 100% ownership?
Yeah, the bill, I believe, is mostly focusing in on public market securities. It can't tell you to divest of private market securities because we don't own the underlying investment. It gets into the partnership complications, but And I'll give you an update on that company tomorrow in
Yeah,
closed session.
yeah. I was just, because I know our stake in it was very, very small.
Mm-hmm.
So.
It's not a matter of our stake, it's a matter of how much of the company's revenues are being driven by these
by the
particular types
industry.
of firearms.
All right, thank you.
So I know you talked, Chris had mentioned about our fiduciary duty and not necessarily having full authority, but then sort of being, held accountable for this. And I'm just wondering how you look at our fiduciary duty in this conversation.
Well, I mean, you've heard me talk ad nauseum about divestment and how it works, and you'll hear me again today in the fiduciary lecture. I disagree with Chris that the motivation behind it may be to trample on your authority, but the effect of it does not interfere with your authority, because the Constitution makes clear that the legislature can attempt to limit your investment discretion in these kinds of situations, but ultimately it's up to you to decide whether you can do so consistent with your fiduciary duty. So it's no different than if you decided on your own to consider divesting in an additional number of gun manufacturers. I'm not thrilled, and I've seen it before in other pieces of legislation, about you having to give notice and announce it, and someone could argue that maybe that would throw cold water politically on you and your ability to say, no, we can't divest because it goes too far, it's not consistent with our fiduciary duty. But I have enough faith in this board that I don't feel that strongly about that requirement, and that I leave up to you. But all in all, it's it's going to depend on, if it's enacted, what'll happen is exactly what happened with your decision to look at the gun manufacturers you asked the staff to look at. They'll decide whether they can replace these gun manufacturers in the portfolio under the everything is equal test. And if they say yes, as they apparently are going to tell you later they can, with respect to the two gun manufacturers that are under consideration based on your earlier decision, if they can say yes, then you can divest. If they say no, the political heat on you may be great, but I'll advise you to say no, that you can't go this far, because it expands the list of gun manufacturers to an untoward degree. You just can't go that far and replace all those companies. I don't know the answer to that question, and that's why I think it's premature to assume that if this is enacted, that you're going to wind up violating your fiduciary duty. If it's enacted, then you'll start the same process.
So you're saying if it's enacted, it doesn't impede the process that we've actually been going through this
Not the way I read it.
winter and spring.
Right.
work
And the same with Sudan and Iran.
Chris, did you want to chime in?
I would just, it goes without saying, I'm not your lawyer, I'm not a lawyer. And I also want to make it clear, I'm not recommending, I just wanted you to know that we had an alternative position on it, but you have a lot of other things to consider, especially this year, and so we recognize that. Ian's right on the point. The one thing I want you to realize with the fiduciary out, we have seen another board use that, Ian, and the heat is so great that board caved in less than 24 hours, because the legislature will call staff in for additional hearings, then they will call the board in for additional hearings. They will threaten your budget. They will do a lot of things. Then they'll enact additional laws and then hold more hearings until you finally relent. And that's exactly the game plan that happened to another board in this state on another issue. So yes, in practice, that language is there, or in legal stand, that language is there. I just want you to understand what happens in practice. So I don't want to, I guess, lead the discussion one way or another. We understand why the neutral if amended, and that's a reasonable position. I'm not telling you as the CIO you can't do it. I just wanted you to be aware of the pros and cons.
Sharon, I just want to add something at this point. What Chris describes is sort of the byproduct of being a a public entity and dealing with the legislature, so I'm not, I don't know how any position we took on the bill would affect that. It's my reading of the California Constitution, Prop 162, is that the Constitution gives the legislature the authority to pass this type of bill, this type of legislation. But clearly, as Ian has pointed out, and has pointed out for many years, that your fiduciary duty comes first, and the Constitution recognizes that. And so in the process, sometimes it is, Chris is clearly pointed out, sometimes it is uncomfortable or difficult for us to assert our fiduciary responsibilities in the context of the legislative process. But again, it's difficult to oppose a measure where the legislature is potentially exercising its constitutional right. My additional comment as your counsel is I would urge staff to, even if it's in other legislation, to urge staff to work with the author to remove the phrase "good faith." And the reason is you're acting on your fiduciary responsibility. And my concern is that at some point somebody's going to be asked to demonstrate that you acted in good faith, and that's not, you act according to your fiduciary responsibilities, and your good faith is as a trustee. So again, if I had my druthers, I would request that they take out the good faith requirement, because it's an unnecessary standard. Anyway, thank you.
So let me just see if there's any other comments from the committee. Ed? Did you
Yeah, I just want to also just make clear that whatever concerns, and I recognize the policy issue that Chris is raising, and obviously that's for you to decide, but if there are other issues around the mechanics of the bill, even though they are very consistent with what's been enacted in the past, we'll work with Chris and with Brian to try to make sure we have a bill that's as easy for us to work with as possible.
Yeah, I think that would be definitely the pleasure of the committee, I would imagine. I think Chris's concerns are valid, and obviously I'd appreciate the staff working collaboratively together to deal with this. And I think the issue you raised, Brian, about the good faith, is that an issue that we can we add that to our amended list of the 15%, the indemnification? Can we add the good faith removal? Dana, did you want to?
Yeah.
I was just gonna move that position, neutral if amended, to include the minimum percentage of 15%, the indemnification, and also the removal of the language in good faith.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. Vote to move the neutral position with those three amendments.
Aye.
Oh, sorry. All those say aye, sorry.
Aye.
All opposed, nay? All right, great, thanks.
Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Chris, thanks, Ian, Brian, Ed. Okay, Marianne, SB 113?
Okay, SB 13 is a urgency bill to provide clarifying and conforming changes to effectively implement PEPRA, or the Public Employees Pension Reform Act, that became effective this January. This bill touches on all retirement systems, CalSTRS, CalPERS, and the County 37 Acts. The board has sponsored AB 1381, which will provide additional cleanup and clarifying language that's specific to CalSTRS. In SB 13 specifically, though, this would allow members with concurrent membership in other retirement systems and CalSTRS to be under the CalSTRS 2% at age 60 formula if they had performed service for another retirement system within 6 months of becoming a member at CalSTRS. And it also clarifies the contribution rates for the CalSTRS 2% at age 62 members. Staff is recommending that the board adopt a neutral position, as this doesn't adverse or significantly impact CalSTRS. Any questions?
Questions from committee?
I'll move the staff's recommendation.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Opposed? Great, excellent, thanks, passed. Thanks, Marianne. Oh, go ahead, Dana. Oops. There you go.
Before we move off the recommendations on the legislation, just to go back to the divestiture one that we just discussed, if those amendments are not accepted, I think the committee, I don't necessarily want to speak for the committee, but I would think that the committee would want to see the bill again if those amendments are not acceptable to the author for a different position.
That's fine. And to be honest with you, I think, I mean, what we have normally done in the past is that the implication is that if the bill is not amended in this form, that the board would be opposed to the
We'll go
bill.
to an opposed.
But if you want us to bring it back specifically that purpose, we can certainly do that. It's entirely up to the committee how they want to handle that.
I think just because it's been, a huge topic in our
Sure.
board, it would probably be helpful to have that come back
Okay,
and take a
we
look
can
at
certainly
it
do that.
because of the unique nature of the topic. Thanks, Ed.
Does, just one question,
Sure.
does that though perhaps mean that by the time we get around to looking at it again, it's kind of too late for any impact on the timing of when the bill is going to get considered?
Not necessarily. I mean, the bill will have probably be in the next committee, the next time the committee would meet if we met in the normal cycle of attached to the board meeting. But this committee can meet at any time that it feels the need to, so we don't have to wait till the June meeting to come back and have a discussion on this bill. But even in June, the bill is still in the assembly, so it's still time to try to affect the outcome.
Great, thanks. Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Marianne, appreciate it. All right, so we're up to item 3, the approval of the minutes for the November 8th, 2012 Legislative Committee. We've had time to take a look at those. We have
I
a
move
motion to
approval.
approve.
So moved.
Okay, all those in favor, aye?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay, we've approved our minutes. Number 4, we've got John Stanton here. Welcome from, I guess it's nice weather in DC right now, isn't it? That's what I hear.
Teeming hordes with the cherry blossoms.
I was gonna say, I'm gonna be there next week, so I'm hoping they're still there when I get there on Sunday, so.
As long as it doesn't rain.
Okay, yeah, that makes them
Or
all
get too
go away.
It's gonna bring a few, but.
Great, so thanks. So we have John here to give us the scoop on what's happening in DC and how that impacts retirement issues in California. So welcome, John.
There's actually a fair amount to report on at the federal level, especially with the release of the administration's budget yesterday. That kind of kicks off the season, as it is, if you will, in Washington and on the Hill, because fiscal matters are really taking front and center, as I'm sure you're reading in the newspaper. And I wanted to give you an overview of how the federal budget situation, which may seem far off, and California is its own sovereign, and we're may take the attitude, well, how does that affect us? But actually, as I'll walk through in a little bit more detail, there's some potentially significant consequences for CalSTRS as a retirement plan and consequences for CalSTRS as an investor in the market. Public plans also continue to be under scrutiny on a variety of other fronts, so we're really I think in the mode of playing defense to some extent in the coming months and coming sort of congressional cycle. The first area I wanted to kind of touch upon is to give some context from the CalSTRS perspective about how this federal budget situation is relevant. I mean, basically, just to kind of provide some background, there are 3 major buckets of consequence in the budget. There's taxes, there are entitlements, and then there's discretionary spending. And discretionary spending, you've read a lot in the newspaper about the sequester and the cuts that have happened there. My sense of it is those cuts are now sort of embedded in the federal budget. And I think it's going to be quite a while before further cutbacks are made on the discretionary side. So that takes a fair amount of the budget sort of off the table, if you will. The government is funded through September. The House and the Senate have passed diametrically opposite budgets for 2014, the coming fiscal year. They're going to be trying to sort of work that out. the debt ceiling is really sort of the next action forcing event. I mean, that, you know, as I'm sure you've gleaned from the papers and otherwise, I mean, the federal government's sort of lurching from crisis to crisis, from sort of action forcing event to action forcing event. I mean, it may seem like the calendar for the federal government's only got 3 pages of months because it seems as though every 3 months there's a crisis. And I think the debt ceiling, which will sort of come to fruition, that fight sometime over the summer, is going to create an opportunity for the potential of a grand bargain, which has thus far eluded the administration and the congressional Republicans. But since discretionary spending is pretty much off the table in my view, I think that leaves entitlements and taxes to be dealt with as a way of trying to address the deficit. I don't think the discretionary part of the budget is slender enough that they're not going to be able to make a major dent in the deficit beyond what they've already done. I mean, they adopted $1 trillion of spending cuts, discretionary spending cuts leading up to the sequester, and on top of that, basically the sequester puts discretionary spending back to President George W. Bush's first term, basically, in real dollars. So I think the focus will be on entitlements. And their entitlements, obviously, front and center, Medicare, and there are lots of things they can do there if the political will is mustered. You've been reading a lot about the Obama administration's ideas on COLAs, cutbacks on payments to providers, potentially raising the eligibility age, which is a very valid issue, means testing. But for us, I think the real focus needs to be on Social Security. And the question there is really, is Social Security going to be swept into entitlement reform? And that really depends a lot on how, quote, the problem is defined with respect to Social Security. Is Social Security part of the deficit problem? It really doesn't contribute to the deficit, but there's a tendency, especially among Republicans in the Congress, to sort of lump Medicare and Social Security together as sort of the entitlements. And in the coming weeks, the House Ways and Means Committee chairman has announced they're going to have hearings on entitlements and what could be done to trim those back. So I think for now, Social Security remains in the mix, and a key part of that, from our perspective, is our old friend, the proposal to mandate Social Security coverage for new state and local workers. And I think the jeopardy that poses really will be determined by whether mandatory coverage comes to be seen as sort of a standalone revenue raiser to fund other things like deficit reduction, or whether it's sort of, up until now, it's been sort of reserved for comprehensive Social Security reform. They say, let's just wait, we'll deal with that issue when we're sort of dealing with the long-term stability of Social Security. We're not going to peel it off as a one-off revenue raiser. But the Simpson-Bowles Commission, the Rivlin Commission on Deficit Reduction, all have proposed use of mandatory Social Security as a one-off revenue raiser to help fund the reduction in the deficit. And it's not hard to see why. I mean, there's new revenue, raises almost $100 billion over 10 years. It's all front-loaded because you're bringing in new hires, taxing them, paying them benefits at the end of their careers in another 40 or 50 years. So it's got a real, siren call from a political perspective, because in any reform effort, you need money up front, and usually you're phasing in the changes that raise that money. And so here's a pot that can be available almost sort of instantaneously. And one of the key developments in the last couple of years, as I've mentioned before, is the Congressional Budget Office did a study that proves that, or doesn't prove, it asserts that the additional new revenues from mandatory coverage are twice the benefits that will ultimately be paid. Because up until that study came out, generally we'd been taking the position that, this was just a sort of a short-term fix, in the sense that you're bringing new people into the system, getting their taxes, but ultimately you're having to pay benefits. What the CBO study says is the federal government always ends up ahead, to the extent of twice as much.
John, can I ask a question?
Sure.
That in terms of, I'm just trying to conceptualize, I know we've talked about this before, where it's like 14 states, is that accurate, that like where teachers don't pay into Social Security? Or I guess I'm just wondering how the numbers of the $24 billion over 5 years, where that comes from. Who are those employees? Where are they?
There are, I always lose track of the number of
I'm
states.
always like, who's not
Well, basically, what
mandatorily
we,
in Social Security?
there are, as you point out, I've forgotten the exact number of states. It's somewhere, around a dozen where the
15,
teachers
14 or 15.
are not in. But one of the things that we've discovered in this debate, in this fight, is that there are pockets of employees all across the country,
Right.
particularly in public safety, who are not in Social Security.
Right.
So the numbers are much greater than you might expect. I mean, one of the politically difficult issues or aspects of this debate for us is you're talking to legislators, many of whom already have their public employees in, their state and local employees are in Social Security. So they're looking at you saying, well, my guys are in,
Right.
the sky didn't fall, so what's the big concern? And up until now, we've been able to effectively point out that a dollar of retirement benefit is more cheaply provided by a funded, well-managed public employee retirement system than a pay-as-you-go, unfunded Social Security system that invests in, low-paying treasuries.
Mm-hmm.
But that's clearly a dynamic because we're kind of now seen as a rounding error. Well, just about everybody else is in, let's just bring them in. And the Simpson Bowles actually did a new spin trying to say that public retirement systems are very risky, and so we ought to all be put into Social Security, which they asserted was less risky and had the backing of the federal government. So there have been a lot of little twists and turns on this, but I think it's going to be a very challenging. We've tried to keep it off the table because this is one of those issues that once it gets on the table, it becomes very hard to sort of replace its revenue-raising capacity with something else. Because then
And
you're
the
going to take
front-loading
something
makes
away
sense.
from somebody else.
Yeah, and the front loading makes sense because they're getting their money up front,
Yeah.
and then they're not going to have to pay it out till these folks are retired. So
That's the perfect perfect political storm. And there are other constituencies now that are beginning to focus on this. The Business Roundtable put out a public statement urging the use of mandatory Social Security coverage to help fund deficit reduction. And SEIU, in some of its statements, has now been, including one that Jack had circulated, that seems to intimate support for mandatory coverage. So I guess I would say to my brothers and sisters in labor and the listening audience that you might want to beckon them back on the path to enlightenment, because particularly among Democrats, if they say, well, labor's split, that's the perfect out. If you're a Democrat who otherwise would be supposed to support us, hey, labor's split on this, I can do whatever I want. So I think that might be something that would be worth following up on. Tax reform. Now this is an area where actually we do have some interest that I'll describe in a minute, but just again to give you some context, because this isn't an issue you necessarily have been following from the public plan perspective, and it's an area where I think you can't sort of be taken in by sort of the macro picture of the warring elephants and partisan divide, because frankly the technical details are being worked on behind the scenes. The House Ways and Means Committee has set up 11 working groups based on issues. Happily, the working group on pensions is chaired by Representative Pat Teaberry from Columbus, Ohio, who happily actually is one of the vanishing breed in Congress, a former state legislator who is now in Congress. He was a majority leader in the Ohio State Legislature. So he's actually voted on bills that affect public plans. He's knowledgeable about them, and I think is generally supportive. He's not sort of taken the partisan tack that some have, particularly the Tea Party, of saying, public plans equal public unions equal strong opposition. And so he's thoughtful, and he's joined by Congressman Ron Kine from Wisconsin, who's very closely allied with the labor group. So I think they're about the most sympathetic that we could muster on that committee for looking at public plans. But clearly, they're going to be looking on the four corners of the tax code, including the public plan rules I'll discuss in a minute. The Finance Committee on the Senate side is doing much the same exercise kind of behind the scenes. Ways and Means is aiming to report a tax bill by, at least the chairman is, by the August break. And I think the key issue there about whether that's going to come together is how they decide whether they're going to try to have this be revenue neutral, where it's always a lot easier to take something away from somebody by saying you're going to lower the rates for everybody else. If you're just trying to raise revenue, it becomes a more challenging task. But You know, I know you're sitting there thinking, well, you know, we're tax exempt pension fund. Why do we care about this? Well, there are two dimensions of this from perspective of CalSTRS as retirement plan, but also CalSTRS as investor in the market. And the potential here is that over the years, public plans have succeeded in really tailoring the federal tax rules that govern pension plans to reflect the unique features of public plans. So there are all these special rules that many of us have had a hand in. They're sort of scattered throughout the pension rules that are tailored to reflect how public plans actually operate. The fear you have in this kind of environment, and I went through this in 1986, which was sort of the Tax Layers Relief Act, is that they don't take things away from people one by one. They don't say, well, we're going to take that away from take that. They just come out with some entirely new one-size-fits-all set of pension rules. And I think this is where, you know, I've told you before that when I first started representing you 23 years ago, it was an accepted given that public plans were different, that if Congress was changing the pension rules, they needed to take account of our unique characteristics to work with us because generally we were not, you know, causing the problem that they are addressing. That's all changed now. And the burden is now shifted to us to say, well, why can't you just live by the rules everyone else does? And I think this is where the Nunez bill and the bruises that public plans have suffered in the last several years really come to bear, because we could easily be facing a situation where they say, look, you know, these pension rules have gotten so complicated, let's just have a fairly straightforward set that's going to apply to everybody. Leading off with the funding rules. Public plans have been exempt from the funding rules that bedevil the private sector. You probably have read about the challenges that are facing private DB plans because of the low interest rates that force these huge contributions, and really I think it's about the last nail in the coffin for private DB plans. They decided to apply those rules to us. Again, the tailored limits on benefits, exemption from non-discrimination that we got because of the public plans, you know, cover all different kinds of people. All that could be sort of swept away. And in the course of it, the question is, well, what about 403B, 457? Well, back under the Bush administration, there had been a proposal to sort of just combine those all into one single sort of supplemental retirement. Why do we have all these special rules for special people? Let's just have one basic way of doing it. And that's got a lot of appeal in a tax reform environment because it's tax simplification is kind of hard to argue. It's sort of like transparency. It's this word that, you know, just seems to kind of, you know, when Congressman Nunez says all he wants to do is achieve transparency, you know, it's kind of hard to quarrel with it on the surface. And this is an area where, you know, all the special features that we've managed to get in 403B and 457 to address the environment in which these plans are used. Again, all those special rules for special people could go away, and at the same time they might consider lowering the contribution limits. And there are a couple different ways in which that could come into play, including what the administration put out yesterday that I'll talk about in a minute. But clearly, as part of this exercise, they're always looking for revenue to offset the tax cuts or the lowering of the rate, and I think employer pickups are a ripe and inviting target because these are, as you know, permit employee contributions to the CalSTRS to be made on a pre-tax basis. Well, federal government, it's after tax. This is sort of a unique situation for state and local pension plans. Now, the argument that's always been made is that, well, that's kind of akin to contributions that are made in the private sector plans because the employer deducts it, the employee's not taxed on it, it's sort of pre-tax to the employee. But right now, and again, I think as a result of the the harsh spotlight on public plans in the last several years, employer pickups, you know, again, special rule for special people, almost $5 billion over 10 years. I think that's one that is vulnerable. Now, the public plans have been, the community has been active in outreach with the Ways and Means Committee and Finance Committee in support of this, but, you know, I just want to kind of highlight this because especially if they're cutting back in other ways on private plans. And one of the ways that the Obama administration has proposed to do it, and it was in their proposal yesterday, is that they're now going to he proposes, now again, he proposes, but Congress disposes and how far this will get. But one of the things let me just back up a second just to give you a little more context on this, because if we're going to have tax reform on the individual side, the big kahunas of tax expenditures are the ability to exclude from your income the health insurance premiums that your employer pays. That's a huge dollar item. The next one is the ability not to be taxed on the contributions that your employer makes on pre-tax employee contributions to pension plans. Then it's, home mortgage, state and local taxes. But the way in which Obama, and this was a similar proposal to what Romney had talked about, capping these itemized deductions, capping these kind of tax preferences, and in the super committee last summer, Republicans were sort of considering some of these, because if your real desire is to lower the rate and claim that political victory, you have to attack the sacred cows to get there. And one way to do it is to say, well, we're just going to cap the ability to claim any itemized deductions, cap the benefit of the exclusion of health insurance premiums that your employer pays, cap the pre-tax treatment of contributions to pension plans, all at the 28% rate. So that if you're above the 28% rate, then you pay tax on the difference between 28 and whatever the individual rate is, now 35% on your employer's health insurance premiums, the pension contributions. They're even proposing it, and I would call it for the benefit of the treasurer, he's proposing to have this apply to the tax exemption for state and local bonds, the interest tax exemption. Those traditionally have been sold often to higher rate people, so they would now, a holder of a tax exempt state and local bond would now be paying tax on the difference between 28 and 35% if they were in the 35% rate. So,
John, can you